All right, good afternoon, everybody. This is Mayshawn Wilson from the Boardroom to the Boardroom podcast. Today we'll be talking with Miss Alice Garcia, talking about parent transitioning, and transitioning HR strategy. I'm your host, as always, Mayshawn Wilson, Global Strategy and Operations, Go-to-Market Strategy at Google, combat veteran, Duke MBA, and West Pointer. And so for those that don't know, Alice Garcia, she's a senior HR strategist at a large bank, a real estate investor, property manager. She also served as the business strategy planning director at USAA, AG officer, West Point Outreach and Admissions Officer. She's a graduate of both West Point and St. Mary's University. So Alice, I'll pass it over to you from here.
Yeah, thanks. I originally from Houston, Texas. I'm a Texas girl at heart. I enjoyed my time at West Point. And then after I was a AG officer in the Army, I moved on to corporate world. I spent about 13 years on the corporate side in HR. And I've recently transitioned to being a small business owner doing property management.
Very nice. And so telling us a little bit more about your background. You said you're from San Antonio. How did you come into the military? Like what kind of prompted that in your life?
It's a schedule change, actually. So I was a varsity swimmer. When I started high school, I tried out for the team, made varsity. And unfortunately, we had to change my schedule. And so I got stuck in Army JROTC. And I remember coming home and telling my mom, like, oh, it's the worst thing ever. I got stuck in ROTC. They wear a uniform. Like, none of the cool kids are in this class. And she pulled me aside and she said, when I was in high school, the women weren't even allowed to be cadets. They had to be sponsors. She said, so I was the sponsor, basically the secretary to the male cadets in her class that were in ROTC or JROTC. So you should be thankful that you can actually be a cadet. And so you're going to be in the class, like stop complaining. Like at least you get the thing that I couldn't, that she couldn't do as a high school student. So I sulked, still sulked, of course, teenage angst. Went through the class. It was easy. We had a test every week on chain of command. And I looked at it as a way to get an easy A, for my GPA. And it was an instructor, starting first class Williams. And he asked me, have you ever thought about joining the drill team? I'm like, well, no, I swim, practice every day. It just so happened that the pool and the ROTC building were next to each other. So I could actually see them practicing when I was swimming laps. And he's like, we could use someone to be involved and, hold the guide on. It's not really that hard. You just hold the guide on. And so he got me into that. Then that was kind of boring and lame to just hold a guide on while everybody else is, spinning the rifles. And so that progressed. And then I was on the drill team, a full member, and would go from one practice to the other. And he's the one who first told me about West Point. So he asked, what are you going to do about college? And I said, well, whoever gives me the most money, where I'm going. Because I knew that we didn't have the money for college. And I knew college was not an option. It was something I was going to have to do. And that I really wanted to do as well. When he told me about West Point, I said, oh, West, California? I don't think my parents are going to like me to go to California. He said, no, it's in New York. I'm like, well, I don't think that's any better. So he ended up talking to my mom, my dad, and told them about West Point. That's really how I found out about it, how I learned about it. I ended up, spoiler alert, staying all 4 years in Army JROTC and leading the Corps for the Houston Independent School District. And it was that life-changing, schedule change from art to ROTC that led me to where I am today.
Very nice. Yeah. And so you mentioned that your mother, she couldn't be a cadet. And so she had tried. And so was some of that like family, I guess, tradition or legacy, was that part of the reason why you stayed? Or was it more you were looking for something else, maybe internal development, opportunities? Can you talk about that?
In JRTC, it definitely was that first, just living up to, my family had a tradition of service. So both my parents worked for the city in different aspects. And this idea of giving back to the community was ingrained in me since I was a child. Whether it's helping your neighbors or feeding homeless, there was always a way to give back. And I found out later on that my dad had been in Vietnam and was in the Army and the Air Force. And while he never pushed any type of military service, it ended up that both my sister and I ended up serving. So I think that culture, it probably comes from the Hispanic culture. There's a lot of giving back in the community and family in our culture. And so it was a way of continuing that legacy of culture and service. On my dad's side, I think I'm the third generation to serve, but the first woman. And so it wasn't something that they boasted about. It was just an expectation that if you're a man in this family, you're going to serve. And so from my dad and his grandfather and his great grandfather, they all had served in the military. But again, it wasn't something that was pushed. It just came, I think, as a way of how you are part of being a good citizen, and the opportunity to be in this country is a way, service is a way of showing that gratitude.
And how has that shaped kind of where you are now? One, kind of where are you now? And then two, can you talk about how that military influence, your Hispanic culture, family kind of influenced where you are now in the HR space?
In the Army, I was a personnel officer. And even as a cadet, I was always more interested in the people in the military and how the people worked. And when I was first thinking of that transition from this military to civilian, I knew that there wasn't always that value of the military human resources work in the corporate side. And so I started out at USAA in a program in order to learn the business. And so I started in insurance, and I knew that I needed to build my reputation and show what I could do and what I was capable of before I could get that role in HR. I really had to build some relationships in order to do that. And so after 2 or 3 years of doing different roles in insurance and as a chief of staff, I was able to move into HR and work in HR strategy, which was my dream job, and got to work in some really cool forward-thinking strategic work when it came to human resources around employee engagement, employee empowerment, how to make employees feel satisfied in the work that they're doing, as well as in the job and on the teams that they're in, as well as forward-thinking and how do you plan for the employee of the future? What does that look like? What are they wanting from a company? What benefits are they wanting? What's the value proposition that companies need to come forward with in order to draw and attract top talent and also retain them? Because you can, a lot of companies will attract talent, but it's the retaining part that's important. If that's the goal of the company, their strategy may be just to attract talent, keep them for a short amount of time, but you find that the longer you keep an employee, the more loyal and hopefully more productive they are as they stay with you for a long amount of time. So, and now my current role, I work in HR strategy for a different bank, and really have loved seeing the similarities as well as the differences between how they both approach planning for that employee of the future, as well as what does that HR function of the future look like. The last, I guess, however long I've been doing this, years, HR has really evolved into not just being a transactional type of function, but really advising the line of business into how they can best utilize their resources, and thinking about how to be advisors to those leaders into how to make better decisions based on things like data and analytics and, organizational effectiveness, that kind of stuff.
I mean, those are very pertinent challenges, especially these days in a post-intra-COVID environment. And so based on that, where do you see yourself going? Do you see yourself as more of like a CHRO? Do you see yourself kind of doing something else? As comfortable as you feel answering that question.
Yeah. I think in the future, I definitely would like to have the opportunity to be a CHRO, particularly with a small startup. I think being able to start with something at the beginning and grow it, as opposed to trying to come in at a big company and fix things. A lot of HR now can be just fixing issues or things that have occurred because you've grown too fast as a company, or you didn't have the right leaders in place, or you didn't have the right structure in place. I'm hoping that in doing that with a startup, I can start correctly, start as at least plan as well as I can, and then grow that business with a visionary leader as the CEO.
And for those young AG officers that are out there, or other human resource professionals, can you give some advice about how HR in the business space is different than military HR, both in scope or also in terms of responsibilities? Anything that's helpful?
They are about people, right? So there's that similarity, of course. The main difference, I would say, is that from a military perspective, you are that strength management of knowing who your backup and your succession plan is one of the most critical parts of resource planning in the military. On the corporate side, I was surprised how lacking a lot of companies can be when it comes to succession planning. There's a lot of times that there's senior leaders that they don't have a plan for, and then somebody leaves to go to another company, or somebody chooses to retire, and they don't have a plan for who's going to take over that role. So that's a key difference. I think the military is actually a lot better at recognition. A lot of us would laugh about or, wonder, we had those kind of medals and achievements and things that sometimes you just felt like was a rubber stamp because you finished a duty station. But I think that in the moment of being in the military, you don't realize that being recognized, even though that's not why you do it, it does mean something. The fact that somebody took the time to write about you and recognize whatever it is that you did for that period of time, it becomes kind of standard and rote, and people don't see that significance. But I feel like on the civilian side, that recognition is sometimes has to be forced, because you don't get an award or a ribbon every time you move a job or move companies. You might get a pat on the back or a poster or a plaque maybe. But I think in a lot of the civilian side, they're not as good at recognizing contribution, and you have to kind of remind people to recognize each other. Whereas I think even though it is something that's expected and has to happen on the military side, you don't realize the value there is of having your peers and your team recognize you, that I felt was missing in the corporate side.
So you're saying in terms of both the recognition component, but also in terms of kind of succession planning, that's kind of the major difference to pick that up, right?
At least I have experience. I'm sure there's a tons of others. Obviously, the career planning is a big one. So I didn't think of the career planning. So in the military, you have your human resources command, and you have, command and things that schools you needed to go to, and things that were kind of lined out for your branch or your area or your MOS that you had to achieve in order to have points for promotions or go to promotion boards. On the civilian side, you have to take ownership of your career. There's no branch manager telling you, hey, you need to go to this school in order to get that job. And there's nobody telling you, this would be a great next step or a feather in your cap for this other opportunity. You have to find a mentor. You have to find and be that advocate for yourself. That is different when you think of HR. There's a small team of people doing talent development and leadership development in the corporate side, but there's not a whole area set up to make sure that, Alice gets to go to this command or to this promotion, or, no one is doing that for you on the corporate side as opposed to the military side. So that's a big difference as well.
And how do you navigate not only that asymmetry, if you will, but also just that you can take any career path that you want to, like whatever you can theoretically conceive, your career can make that progression?
Yeah. I mean, it's overwhelming at first, right? Because you're realizing you're getting out of the military. I think for myself, there's so many options. Like I can be all that I can be, but what is that I want to do? And it comes down to doing your research in a lot of ways. There were figuring out what makes you happy. In the Army, I didn't really, not that the job didn't make me happy, but I didn't have a choice in them. They just told me, this is where you're going next, and you go and you do the job. You get a job description and you do it. I didn't choose necessarily, except maybe diversity admissions. So I applied for that one. But otherwise, I didn't choose necessarily the job that was given to me. On the corporate side, or your post-military career, you are the author of your career. You get to figure out what is it you want to do. And that is terrifying in some ways if you don't know. And so I've always, for me, I started researching like 2 years out. I started going to conferences and figuring out, there's a lot of people who want to hire veterans. Do I want to do the jobs they're trying to have me do? Do I want to do sales? Do I want to do retail? What's important to me? Is it location, or is it the title? Is it the pay, or is it the work? And, there's a lot of assessments, and there's a lot of, resources for veterans during that transition time that I don't think, because there's so many, that they take advantage of, or maybe you take advantage of one, or just it's so overwhelming. You take whatever job is offered to you first, and you don't negotiate, and you're happy that you have a job. But doing your research ahead of time and figuring out, what are the things that you like doing that are in other jobs. So not necessarily a job title, but the job work, which is harder, I think, when you're transitioning, because you don't know what you don't know. Like the civilian titles are all different. And so that's where I think those transitioning programs and career coaching and talking to other veterans who've done the transition and working with some of those nonprofits that will help you is key in helping you focus into what you want to do, and then helping you figure out what are the steps you need to do to get there.
all great nuggets, especially, you can fall into the veteran monolith of sales, operations, like building security.
Yeah.
Got it. And you're like, that's cool. Okay. Or I could do something else.
Yeah, I hear everyone saying that they're going to be a project manager, and like, okay, do you know what they do? Do you have a certification? Have you actually figured out just because you did the function a lot in the military, is that really what you want to do? Or is it because, everyone is getting out and becoming a project or a program manager? That may not be the job for you.
Also, an even better point, letting something that you decided 18 or 22, 21 determine the rest of your working career as opposed to branching out. And so I guess along that line, since you decided to stay in HR, can you talk about where you said the people were kind of what kept you there? What is it about corporate HR that kind of kept you in that space as opposed to, say, branching out into whether it's learning and development or some other piece that's a bit more segmented within HR?
So I found actually a former mentor sat me down when I was trying to decide what I wanted, what I wanted to do within USAA. He asked me, what are the three things that you like doing, regardless of the job, but just three things that you think in a job you enjoy doing that make you happy. And for me, it was strategic, and so high level thinking, planning out the future, looking forward, the visionary type of work. It was with people. So sitting behind a desk is not the job for me. So I needed to be in a team environment where there was people interaction, and that there was opportunities to solve problems. And so in those three things I've used to evaluate different roles to see whether I would pursue them. So for HR, what I've liked about the strategy work is that it fulfills all of those for me. There's that definitely strategic long-term thinking. It's not the tactical solve this problem. It's getting ahead and thinking and solving out the big problems that will take, phased approaches in order to solve, and things that you have to kind of organize and think out long-term that have a lot of moving pieces. So when you're talking about HR strategy, I like it because it hits all of the different functions of HR. You have to think about the strategy as a whole, not just the strategy for L&D or the strategy for, rewards or benefits or for people development. And it's the whole aspect. You can work with particular functions within that, but I like that big picture, and that part that it's usually a team of people that are working on it is important to me as well. And then it's solving problems. So I've liked that the strategy work allows me to be around things that I'm passionate about. So employee engagement, employee empowerment, those were things that I didn't realize that's what they were called. For the military, it was like, yeah, I have my soldiers, they just go do it. That empowerment, we didn't talk about it as empowerment. It was just, that's what you do. You trust your people and they go do their jobs. Whereas in the civilian side, when they would talk about, we got to empower our people to go and make a decision. Well, yeah, that's kind of what you're supposed to do. And so it was that difference of being passionate about helping people achieve all that they can achieve, but on that broader scale, and helping a company influence and impact their employees in order to achieve not only what they want to achieve as individuals and as employees, but from a company perspective and achieving goals and their long-term strategies.
So if I understand correctly, one, having a really clear idea of what the commander's intent is, if you will. Yeah. And then from there, you wanted to have like a broad spectrum across the entire HR space rather than focusing in one particular segment. Mm-hmm. And knowing kind of within that role, what gives you energy, and that sua sponte or taking the initiative isn't necessarily a given when you pivot.
Yeah.